All right, the death of Reverend Vivian and Congressman Lewis has shaken Atlanta, and it has made everyone reflective about their meaning here in this city, in this region, in this nation, in the world for that matter. With the news of Congressman Lewis's death, many still were mourning the loss of Reverend Vivian. He died in Atlanta. What a life. Lived to be 95, both instrumental in passing the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act. And both men were freedom riders and experienced unbelievable violence, impossible to comprehend. They were fearless in their fight for equality, promoting change through nonviolence, though oftentimes they saw violence right in their face. It was always part of their lives during that era. Reverend Vivian was an ally of Dr. King. The two met during the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott. And he was an intellectual. He was a thinker. He was a man who had great ideas, who was well-read, collected art, and he was involved in countless peaceful protests. He is also widely regarded for his work with the SCLC. He moved to Atlanta in 1975. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2013. And when President Obama put the medal around his neck, he said, "This is the world's greatest preacher." And everybody smiled and nodded. They remembered that that's what Dr. King said of Reverend Vivian. But these two men, their lives here in Atlanta, touching us in so many different ways. Reverend Vivian founded a company in the mid-1970s that's now run by his son Al. It's called Basic Diversity, and they teach issues of race and diversity, from companies to Starbucks to the Atlanta Hawks to Leadership Atlanta. It is quite a business and quite a session. And also on my Facebook page, Jeff Hullinger 11 Alive, I've written a story about John Lewis as City Councilman John Lewis. He saved in-town, midtown, when government wasn't doing anything except wanting to bring through a freeway, a 6-lane freeway through midtown and in-town. He was the one who stood up and said no, and he backed the neighborhood activists. Think of Atlanta without Virginia Highland or Morningside or Ponce City Market or the Old Fourth Ward or Ponce Highlands. You can thank John Lewis in part for making sure that our city stays as it is. We'll take a break. We're back right after this.